By the time the train pulled away from Willow Ridge Depot, Nora Whitcomb had learned that a promise could travel 1,800 miles by letter and still die the moment it had to look a woman in the face. The whistle screamed into the cold Wyoming afternoon, long and sharp enough to make the windows of the station tremble, and steam rolled over the platform like a white curtain closing on the last life Nora had known. She stood beside a battered wooden trunk with both hands locked around a folded letter, the paper soft from being read too many times on the journey west. Pennsylvania was gone behind her. Her aunt was buried. Her rented room had been given to someone else. Everything she owned now sat in that trunk, tied with fraying rope and marked with her name in careful black paint, Eleanor Whitcomb. No one here called her Eleanor. No one here knew enough of her to shorten it to Nora with kindness. The rain had turned fine and cold, needling through her faded brown traveling coat and settling into the hem of her blue calico dress, which pulled too tightly at the waist after 2 days of train food and fear. She was a soft, chubby young woman of 24, with auburn hair pinned beneath a plain bonnet, hazel eyes reddened by sleeplessness, and a face that might have looked cheerful if hope had not been stripped from it one public glance at a time. Preston Vale had arrived 10 minutes late, dressed in a black town coat too fine for the mud at his boots. He had held her letter in one gloved hand, looked from her face to her figure, then to the trunk as if all three had disappointed him equally. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, not loudly, but loud enough for the station master and 2 freight hands to hear, "there has been a misunderstanding." Nora felt the cold move under her collar. "Mr. Vale, I came as your letter asked. You wrote that the wedding could take place within the week." His mouth tightened. "I wrote to a woman who represented herself differently." She looked down at the letter, then back at him. "I wrote you the truth." His eyes passed over her again, and this time the shame of it reached her skin before the words did. "A man in my position requires a wife who can manage appearances as well as a household. You are not what I expected." Behind him, one freight hand pretended to inspect a crate. The other looked away. The station master cleared his throat, but said nothing. Nora's fingers crushed the edge of the letter. "I sold my furniture to pay the rest of the fare. That was your decision. You promised a home." Preston adjusted his cuff. "And I have decided not to proceed. There is a return train next Tuesday if you can arrange passage." The word return struck harder than refusal. Return to what? To an empty room? To neighbors who had watched her leave with her chin high and one trunk of brave foolishness? Rain gathered on her lashes, but she would not give him the satisfaction of mistaking it for tears. "Then give me back the second letter," she said. His expression cooled. "I do not know what you mean. The one where you said you would cover the full fare once I arrived. The one with your signature." Preston folded his own copy of the correspondence and slipped it inside his coat. "Be careful, Miss Whitcomb. Desperate women are often confused women." He turned then, as if turning were enough to erase her. Nora bent to lift the trunk handle, but the weight dragged her shoulder low and the wet platform made her boot slip. A small brown glove fell from her pocket. She crouched to retrieve it, and her hands shook so badly she could not work the button at her cuff. The train gave one final groan and began to move. Car by car, window by window, it carried away every witness who might have believed she had arrived with permission to hope. Preston stepped off the platform toward town. "Good afternoon," he said, as though leaving a bride shivering beside freight was a matter of weather. Then, from the shadowed freight office at the far end of the depot, a man's voice spoke, low and steady. "Forgot something, Vale?" Preston stopped. Nora did too. A tall cowboy stood beneath the overhang, one shoulder against a post, rain dripping from the brim of his worn brown Stetson. His dark blue shirt was dusty from travel, his leather vest marked by work, and his face, sun-browned and unreadable, held no amusement at all. His eyes moved briefly to Nora's trembling hands, then to the trunk Preston had left beside her like rejected cargo. The depot seemed to shrink around the silence. Preston forced a laugh. "This is none of your concern, Callahan." The cowboy stepped into the rain, slow enough that every board under his boots gave a careful sound. "A woman freezing on my depot platform is concern enough. Wade Callahan did not raise his voice, yet the whole platform seemed to hear him better than they had heard Preston Vale's polished dismissal. Rain ticked against the depot roof, dripped from the brim of Wade's Stetson, and darkened the shoulders of his worn coat as he crossed the boards with the slow certainty of a man who had measured trouble before and found it smaller than his conscience. Preston turned halfway back, annoyance tightening his mouth. "You misunderstand the situation." Wade stopped beside Nora's trunk, not close enough to crowd her, but close enough that the freight hands no longer pretended not to watch. "I understood the part where she came 1,800 miles because of your letters." Preston's eyes flicked toward Nora, then toward the station master. "Private correspondence is not public business. Leaving her in the rain made it public." Nora kept her gaze lowered to the glove clenched in her hand, but every word moved through her like the strike of a match. No one had spoken for her since she stepped off the train. No one had even looked long enough to decide whether she was a person or an inconvenience. Yet this stranger did not look at her with pity, and somehow that made her more afraid than if he had. Pity was familiar. Respect was not. Preston gave a short laugh that had no humor in it. "If you are feeling charitable, Callahan, perhaps you can direct her to the church ladies. I have business to attend to." Wade's eyes moved to the folded letter still crushed in Nora's fingers. "Did you promise to marry her?" Preston's jaw set. "I made an inquiry. Nothing more." Nora's head lifted. Rain clung to her lashes, and her voice came out quieter than she wanted, but it did not break. "You wrote that I should bring my blue dress. Because a wedding photograph would please your mother." A sound moved through the freight hands, small but unmistakable. The station master looked sharply at Preston. Color rose above Preston's collar. "A foolish line in a letter does not bind a man to a lifetime mistake." The words landed hard, and Nora felt her cheeks burn. Not because she believed him, but because part of her still feared everyone else might. Her body had been judged by his glance, her courage by his convenience, her whole future reduced to a mistake spoken beneath a station roof. Wade's expression did not change much, but his hand lowered to the handle of her trunk. "Then I reckon we are done hearing from you." Preston stepped forward. "That trunk stays until her lodging and return arrangements are settled." Wade looked at the trunk, then at Preston. "It has her name on it. It arrived under my correspondence. It leaves under hers." Wade bent and lifted the trunk as if its weight meant nothing, though Nora knew how heavy it was, packed with iron dresses, 2 books, her mother's quilt, a tin of sewing needles, and every foolish scrap of hope she had dared carry west. He set it in the back of his wagon, beneath the canvas, away from the rain. Preston's face sharpened. "Taking rejected goods now, Callahan?" The station platform went still. Nora's breath caught in her throat, but before shame could pull her eyes down again, Wade turned fully toward Preston. His voice stayed low, plain, and dangerous only because it was so controlled. "No. I am taking a woman home before cowards freeze her on a platform." The silence after that was not empty. It was full of people deciding what kind of men they were willing to be in front of one another. Preston adjusted his gloves, but his fingers fumbled once. "You always had a taste for broken causes." For the first time, something old and painful crossed Wade's face. It passed quickly, like a shadow over prairie grass, but Nora saw it. Then he turned to her, and the hardness left his eyes. He did not reach for her hand. He did not touch her sleeve. He only stood beside the wagon with rain sliding down his hat brim and asked, "May I carry this for you, Miss Whitcomb?" The question nearly undid her. He had already lifted the trunk. He had already taken the insult meant for her and turned it back on the man who spoke it. Yet he still asked permission, as if her consent mattered after everyone else had spent the afternoon handling her future without it. Nora swallowed. "You already did. Then I am asking whether I may keep it dry until you decide where you want it put." She stared at him, trying to find the trap in the kindness. Men made offers when they wanted something. Preston had offered a home and wanted a prettier dream. Landlords offered rooms and wanted rent before warmth. Even churches offered charity with questions folded inside it. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Wade's gaze did not flicker. "Right now? For you to get out of the rain. And after that? A hot meal." A locked room. Time enough to think. That is not an answer. It is the only honest one I have. Preston made a noise of disgust. You cannot simply haul a woman to your ranch and call it decency. Wade looked back at him. I am not hauling anyone anywhere. She can ride to the boarding house, the church, the sheriff, or my ranch if she chooses. Difference between you and me is I am asking. Nora felt the station master watching her now and the freight hands, and two women beneath the far awning who had paused with market baskets on their arms. Every eye pressed against her wet coat. A half hour ago, she had crossed this same platform believing she would become a wife by sunset. Now she stood with no husband, no ticket, no money for a room beyond perhaps one night if she skipped supper, and a cowboy she had never met was offering choices so carefully they frightened her. She looked toward Preston. His face held no regret, only impatience that the scene had lasted too long. She looked toward Wade's wagon, where her trunk sat under canvas, not claimed, not hidden, simply protected from the rain. The boarding house, she said at last. For tonight. Wade nodded once, as if her choice were law. Yes, ma'am. He stepped back and opened the wagon side without offering his hand until she reached for the rail herself. Only when her boot slipped on the wet step did his hand hover near her elbow, close enough to help, not close enough to take over. She steadied herself without touching him, and he let her. As the wagon rolled away from the depot, Preston's voice followed, sharp through the rain. You will regret this, Miss Whitcomb. Nora turned, wet bonnet ribbons clinging to her cheek. For one small second, she expected fear to answer for her. Instead, Wade spoke without looking back. No, she will decide that too. Nora sat very still beside him as the depot disappeared behind a curtain of rain. The trunk did not shift in the wagon bed. The letter remained in her lap. Her future was still uncertain, still cold, still frightening. But for the first time since stepping off the train, it was no longer being decided without her. The boarding house smelled of boiled coffee, damp wool, and secrets that had settled into the wallpaper long before Nora Whitcomb crossed its threshold. Mrs. Lydia Crow stood behind the front desk with a ledger open beneath one hand and a smile that did not warm her eyes. She was a narrow woman in a black dress with a lace collar buttoned too tightly at the throat, and she looked at Nora's wet hem, her softened figure, her trembling fingers, and the trunk Wade carried in behind her with the quick measurement of someone pricing damage. Mr. Callahan, she said, voice smooth as pressed linen. I did not expect you in town tonight. Wade set Nora's trunk near the stairs, but did not step away from it until Nora had moved beside it. Miss Whitcomb needs a room. Mrs. Crow's gaze slid to Nora. Does she? The question sounded small, but Nora felt the hook inside it. For one night, Nora said, lifting her chin. If you have one available. Rooms cost money, dear. Wade reached into his coat, but Nora spoke before he could place coins on the desk. I can pay for one night. She opened her reticule and counted the few coins left from the journey, feeling each one leave her palm like a little piece of pride. Mrs. Crow watched the amount, then sighed as if generosity pained her. The back room under the eaves. It is not fancy, but beggars rarely require lace curtains. Wade's eyes narrowed. She is a guest. Mrs. Crow smiled toward him. Of course. She took a key from a nail and held it out, but Wade did not take it. Nora did. The metal was cold and real in her hand. Wade lifted the trunk again and carried it upstairs behind her, stopping outside the small room while she unlocked the door. He placed the trunk just inside the threshold, then stepped back into the hall. The room was narrow, with a slanted ceiling, a washstand, a quilt faded nearly white, and a single small window blurred by rain. To Nora, it looked less like shelter than a pause before the next humiliation. Wade removed his hat. I will be downstairs until supper. After that, I can ask the sheriff about a safe place to stay, or I can send for the church ladies, or I can take you to my ranch in the morning if that is what you choose. Nora kept one hand on the door. You list choices the way a banker lists debts. He accepted that without offense. Then I will say it plainer. No one decides tonight but you. She searched his face for impatience, for hunger, for the satisfaction men sometimes showed when gratitude began to corner a woman. She found only rain on his shoulders and a tired steadiness in his eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Why does it matter to you?" Wade looked once down the hallway, where Mrs. Crow's footsteps had paused too long near the stairs. "Because I've seen what happens when a woman's choices are taken one at a time until none are left." Then he stepped back. "Lock the door, Miss Whitcomb." She did. She locked it, then dragged the chair beneath the knob and stood there listening until his boots moved away. Only when the hallway fell quiet did Nora turn to the trunk. Her fingers fumbled with the latch, not from cold now, but from the panic that had been waiting for privacy. Inside lay her folded dresses, her mother's quilt, a small Bible, a tin of needles, and the bundle of letters tied with blue thread. She sank to the floor and untied them quickly. Preston's first letter was there, asking after her health. The second, praising her handwriting. The third, saying he wanted a wife of steady character more than beauty. Her throat tightened. At that lie, the fourth letter promised a home. The fifth described the white church at Willow Ridge. But the sixth, the one that mattered most, the one where he promised to cover the remainder of her fare and marry her within the week, was gone. Nora emptied the trunk piece by piece. She shook out the quilt, checked between books, opened the sewing tin, searched the side pocket where she had placed it before boarding the final train. Nothing. The room seemed to tilt. Without that letter, Preston could claim she had come on her own foolish hope. Without that letter, her debt could become whatever he and Mrs. Crow decided to write down. A soft knock came at the door. Nora froze. "Dear." Mrs. Crow's voice floated through the wood. "Supper is served if you have the appetite." "I am not hungry." Shame. A warm meal helps a woman think clearly. The knob turned once against the chair, gently, testing. Nora's hand closed around the missing bundle of letters. "I said I am not hungry." A pause. Then Mrs. Crow lowered her voice. "Mr. Vale is a respected man here. If he says there has been a misunderstanding, the town will believe him. But I am not without sympathy. A girl in your position can work off lodging, laundry, mending, kitchen help. Nothing disgraceful if you keep your manners." Nora stared at the door as the meaning settled over her. A room was becoming a debt. A meal would become a debt. Every hour she breathed beneath this roof might become a line in Mrs. Crow's ledger. "I will leave in the morning," Nora said. "With what money, dear?" Mrs. Crow asked softly. "Return fare is not charity. Nor is storage for a trunk. Nor is reputation, once a woman has misplaced it." The footsteps retreated. Nora remained on the floor until the lamp burned low, the missing letter more present than every paper she still held. Near midnight, another sound came from the hallway, not a knock, but the faint scrape of paper against wood. Nora waited, then moved the chair enough to open the door a finger's width. A folded note lay on the floor. At the far end of the hall, Wade stood near the stairwell, one hand resting on the banister, his face half-shadowed by lamplight. He did not approach. "Mrs. Crow keeps outgoing mail in the front room," he said quietly. "I saw an envelope tonight with Vale's seal." It was not addressed to him. Nora's pulse beat hard in her throat. "Why tell me?" "Because if a paper was taken from you, I figure you ought to know where paper goes in this house." She looked down at the note. It held only 5 words, "Ask who profits from stranded brides." When she looked back up, Wade had stepped farther away, giving her the hallway as if it too belonged to her. Nora closed the door and leaned against it, the note pressed between her palms. For the first time since Preston turned his back at the depot, fear did not feel like the end of the road. It felt like a trail marker. By dawn, Nora had not slept more than an hour, but exhaustion had sharpened her rather than softened her. She packed her trunk with the careful silence of a woman who had learned that leaving could be its own kind of courage. The missing letter was still missing, Mrs. Crow still had her ledger, and Preston Vale still had the town's respect folded around him like a clean collar, but Nora had one thing she had not possessed the day before, a question worth following. "Ask who profits from stranded brides." The words stayed in her mind as she carried her reticule downstairs. Wade Callahan was waiting in the front room near the cold stove, hat in hand, speaking quietly with the station master, who had come by before opening the depot. Mrs. Crow stood behind her desk with her ledger open, watching all three of them as if the morning belonged to her. "Leaving so soon, Miss Whitcomb?" she asked. Nora placed the room key on the desk. "Yes." Mrs. Crow's mouth curved. "Then we must settle your account." Wade did not move. Nora did not look at him. She looked at the ledger. For one room and no supper. Room, firewood, linen, trunk storage, and inconvenience. Inconvenience. Women without arrangements create questions. Questions damage a respectable house. Nora felt the old heat rise in her face, but she kept her voice level. "Then write the amount. I like to see numbers before I fear them." For the first time, Mrs. Crow's smile thinned. "The station." Master glanced at Wade, then at Nora, and something in his expression suggested he was beginning to understand that the stranded bride from yesterday had not washed away with the rain. Mrs. Crow wrote a figure. It was absurd. Nora could tell by the station master's quick intake of breath. Before Wade could speak, Nora lifted the paper. "Thank you," she said. "I will keep this." Mrs. Crow reached for it. "That is my invoice. It has my name on it." Nora folded it and slipped it into her reticule. "I learned yesterday that papers with my name should not leave my sight." Wade's eyes flicked toward her, not surprised exactly, but proud in a way he had no right to be and yet somehow did. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the street washed gray and shining beneath a pale sky. Wade loaded Nora's trunk into his wagon, covering it with canvas before tying down sacks of feed from the mercantile. He offered the front bench without a word. Nora climbed up herself, lifting her skirts clear of the muddy wheel, and he waited until she was settled before taking the reins. They left Willow Ridge slowly, wagon wheels cutting through wet ruts, the depot shrinking behind them. For the first mile, neither spoke. The land opened into rolling grass, low hills, and black cottonwoods along a creek swollen by rain. Nora kept one hand on the reticule where Mrs. Crow's invoice rested beside Preston's letters. The air smelled of sage, damp earth, and horse leather. It should have frightened her less than the town, but open country had its own kind of honesty. There was nowhere to hide from what came next. "You should know," Wade said at last, "my ranch is not a fine house. I was not expecting one. It has a roof that holds unless the wind comes from the north, a stove that smokes if the flue is lazy, and 3 ranch hands who think coffee is a food group." Nora looked at him then, and despite herself, a small breath that was almost laughter escaped her. "That sounds more honest than what I was promised." His mouth softened, but he kept his eyes on the road. "You will have a room with a lock. I will sleep in the bunkhouse." "You keep saying that as if locks are proof of kindness." "No," he said. "But they're a start." The answer settled between them, simple and unpolished. When the wind picked up, he drew a wool coat from beneath the bench and set it beside her, not over her shoulders, not into her lap, only beside her where she could choose it. Nora waited longer than she needed to before taking it. The wool was warm and smelled faintly of cedar smoke. "Thank you. You're welcome." By midday, the road climbed a ridge and Callahan Ranch appeared below them, spread across a wide bowl of prairie. The house was 2 stories of weathered timber with a long porch and a stone chimney, larger than Nora expected but lonelier too. A barn leaned against the wind near a corral, chickens scattered by the wagon wheels, and a windmill turned slowly beside the well. Nothing about it was polished, but everything seemed to be waiting. Wade stopped the team near the porch. A gray-haired man came from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Amos Reed," Wade said. "My foreman." "Amos, this is Miss Whitcomb. She is a guest." Amos removed his hat at once. "Ma'am." The word guest was small, but Nora heard how carefully Wade placed it. Not bride. Not burden. Not charity. Guest. Inside, the house smelled of cold ashes and coffee. The front room was neat but spare, with a stone fireplace, a plain table, shelves of dusty books, and one chair drawn closer to the hearth than the rest, as if only one person had lived there for years. Nora noticed a narrow hallway leading to a closed door near the back. Wade followed her gaze. Pantry is on the left. Office on the right. That door stays shut. His voice changed around the last sentence. Not harsh, but guarded. Why? She asked before she could stop herself. Wade set her trunk near the stairs. Because it belonged to someone who is not here anymore. Nora understood absence better than most people. She did not ask again. Over the next few days, Callahan Ranch revealed itself in small, honest ways. The stove did smoke when the wind turned. The ranch hands did treat coffee like a meal. The pantry had flour but no order, beans but no labels, and enough salt pork to discourage hope. Nora began with the kitchen. Because work kept her fear from finding too much room. She made stew from what she could salvage, biscuits from hard flour and curtains from a torn sheet she found in a basket. Wade told her twice she did not have to earn her keep. The third time, she answered without looking up from the mending in her lap. I know. I am earning myself back. He did not argue after that. Each evening, she saw him pause near the closed door at the end of the hall. He never touched the knob. He only stood there for a moment, hat in hand, then went out to the bunkhouse. On the fourth night, a gust blew the lamp low while Nora was sorting old receipts in the office, looking for any familiar name from Mrs. Crow's invoice. A thin ledger slipped from behind a stack of feed bills and fell open on the floor. Nora bent to pick it up, and the name on the page turned her hands cold. Rose Callahan. Paid lodging. Rail fare advanced. Bride placement fee. Willow Ridge boarding house. Nora stared at the words until they blurred. Behind her, Wade stopped in the doorway. He saw the ledger. He saw her face. For a long moment, the house was silent except for the wind pressing against the windows. Rose was my sister, he said quietly. Nora looked from the page to the closed door down the hall, and suddenly the coldness of the ranch made terrible sense. Wade did not move toward the ledger at first. He stayed in the doorway of the office, as if crossing the room would turn the name on the page into something sharper than memory. Nora knelt beside the fallen book, one hand resting on the open page, her heart beating with a slow, terrible understanding that her story had not begun at Willow Ridge Depot and might not end with her unless someone made it stop. Rose Callahan's name sat there in the same neat style of ink Mrs. Crow used on her invoices, followed by fees for rail fare, lodging, placement, meals, laundry, and something called reputation damages. The phrase made Nora's mouth go dry. Men and women like Preston Vale and Lydia Crow could take a woman's hope, strand her in a town, charge her for the roof over her head, and then charge her again. For the shame they had caused. Wade stepped inside at last, slowly, as though the floorboards might remember his grief. She was 19, he said. Rose thought she was going to marry a schoolmaster in Cheyenne. He wrote for 6 months. Said he admired her spirit. Said he needed a wife who could bring music into a lonely house. His voice stayed low, but Nora heard the strain beneath it. I warned her letters were easy things. She told me a man who wrote that gently could not mean harm. Nora looked down at the ledger. Did she come through this boarding house? Wade nodded once. Lydia Crow called it assistance. Preston Vale was not involved then, not by name, but his uncle owned the mercantile and handled the mail contracts. Rose came back after 3 weeks with nothing but her carpet bag and a debt paper she was too ashamed to show me. The lamp hissed softly. Outside, rain began again, tapping the roof in small, patient beats. Nora closed the ledger with care, not because the book deserved gentleness, but because the dead did. What happened to her? Wade looked toward the hallway, toward the closed door that had held its silence for years. She lived. For a while. But she never sang again. The answer was worse than the dramatic one Nora had feared because it was quieter, more believable, and full of years. She rose, holding the ledger against her chest. Then this was not one mistake. It was a business. The word business seemed to harden the room. Wade's jaw tightened. I should have looked closer. You were grieving. I was angry. Those can blind a person the same way. He looked at her then, and something in his face eased, not into comfort, but into being understood. Nora carried the ledger to the desk and opened Mrs. Crow's invoice beside it. The handwriting matched too closely to ignore. She pulled Preston's letters from her reticule and laid them in order, then added the note Wade had slipped beneath her door. Ask who profits from stranded brides. She had thought the question pointed to her missing letter. Now she saw it pointed everywhere. Over the next 2 days, the office became a map of stolen futures. Nora sorted old receipts by date, by name, by place. Wade brought every box he had kept from Rose's belongings, leaving each one at the office door until Nora invited him in. Amos Reed found a packet of freight records in the barn loft, brittle with age but still readable. A ranch hand named Thomas remembered delivering mail sacks to Mrs. Crow's boarding house on days when no official mail pickup was scheduled. Nora wrote names in a clean column: Rose Callahan, Mabel Price, June Atwood, Sarah Bell, Eleanor Whitcomb. Not all had been abandoned by the same man, but all had passed through the same hands, the same lodging fees, the same debt language. Each name made Nora sit straighter. Each name made her less alone. On the 3rd evening, Wade found her still at the desk long after supper, a pencil tucked behind her ear, her auburn hair slipping loose from its pins, her cream calico sleeves rolled to the elbow. "You need rest," he said. So did they. He had no answer for that. Instead, he set a cup of coffee beside her and remained standing at a respectful distance. "If I ride into town tomorrow, I can bring the sheriff." Nora shook her head. "Not yet. Nora." It was the first time he used her name without formality, and the sound of it nearly pulled her from the work. She looked up. He seemed to realize what he had done, but he did not take it back. "Preston will not wait forever," he said. "Neither will Lydia." "Good," Nora replied. "Let them come impatient. Impatient people bring the papers they think will frighten you." Wade studied her as though seeing not the woman left shivering at the depot, but someone who had been there all along beneath the wet coat and public shame. "You are not afraid?" "I am terrified." Her fingers closed around the pencil until the wood pressed into her skin. "But fear is not a commandment." Before Wade could answer, hoofbeats sounded outside, more than one horse, slowing at the yard gate. Amos called from the porch, his voice sharp with warning but not panic. Wade turned, and Nora rose with the ledger in her hands. Through the rain-streaked window, she saw a buggy near the steps, Preston Vale stepping down in a dark coat, Mrs. Crow behind him beneath a black umbrella, and Deputy Harlan Pike holding a leather folder against his chest as if paper itself had dragged him there. Preston looked up at the house and smiled, the same thin smile he had worn at the depot. "Miss Whitcomb," he called through the rain, "we have come to settle your obligations." Wade reached for his hat, but Nora moved first. She gathered Preston's letters, Mrs. Crow's invoice, and Rose's ledger, then placed them inside her trunk. Wade looked at her. "What are you doing?" Nora closed the latch, her hands steady now. "If they used paper to trap us," she said, lifting the trunk key from the desk, "then paper will free us." The rain made a silver curtain between the porch and the yard, but Nora could see Preston Vale clearly through it, standing beside the buggy as if Callahan Ranch were an office where he had come to collect a late payment. Mrs. Crow remained beneath her umbrella, dry and narrow and watchful, while Deputy Harlan Pike shifted his weight in the mud with the unhappy look of a man who had been handed papers and told they were truth. Wade stepped onto the porch first, his hat low, his shoulders broad beneath his dark coat, but he stopped at the top step when Nora came to stand beside him with her trunk key closed in her palm. He did not ask her to go back inside. He did not tell her this was men's business. That alone steadied her more than any promise could have. Preston looked from Wade to Nora and smiled with the same polished patience that had once crossed an entire platform without shame. "Miss Whitcomb," he called, "this unpleasantness can end quickly if you come with us and settle what you owe." Nora felt the words reach for the part of her that still remembered the depot, wet gloves, staring men, and the terrible sound of the train leaving. She placed one hand on the porch rail, not because she needed support, but because she wanted something solid beneath her fingers. "I owe you nothing." Preston sighed as though disappointed by a child. "That is not what the documents say." Deputy Pike climbed the steps and removed a folded paper from the leather folder. Mr. Vale has filed a claim for breach of promise expenses advanced. Rail fare, lodging, storage, and brokerage fees. Mrs. Crow has also submitted an account for unpaid room charges. Wade's jaw tightened. She stayed one night. Mrs. Crow's umbrella tilted slightly as she spoke. One night can be costly when a woman arrives with confusion and scandal. Nora turned her face toward her. You mean when a woman arrives alone? Mrs. Crow did not answer. Preston stepped closer to the porch, carefully avoiding the deeper mud. This does not need to become public. Miss Whitcomb may work off the amount respectably under Mrs. Crow's supervision, and when the balance is satisfied, she may make whatever arrangements suit her station. The phrase work off the amount settled cold in Nora's stomach. There it was again, a door dressed up as mercy, a cage labeled respectability. Wade's hand flexed once at his side, but he remained quiet. Nora had asked for that without speaking, and he understood. She looked at Deputy Pike. Have you read the papers he gave you? The deputy colored slightly. I reviewed the claim. Did you read the letters he sent me? Preston's smile faded by a fraction. Private letters are not legal instruments. They became legal enough when you used them to bring me here. Nora turned and walked into the house. For one sharp second, every eye followed her, perhaps thinking she had retreated. Instead, she returned carrying her trunk in both hands. It was heavy enough to pull at her arms, but she would not let Wade carry it this time. She set it on the porch table, unlocked it, and lifted the top tray. Preston gave a short laugh. Displaying gowns will not change debt. Nora ignored him. Beneath the folded dresses and sewing tin, she pressed her fingers into the lining where her mother had stitched a hidden pocket years before for travel money. She had searched it before and found nothing but old ribbon. Now she slipped the ribbon loose and removed a second bundle of papers wrapped in cotton. Wade's eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but recognition that she had held back one place in the trunk even from herself. Nora unfolded the first paper. It was not the missing letter. It was a copy, thinner and creased, written in Preston's hand because Nora had once feared losing the original and copied it before leaving Pennsylvania. Her voice remained steady as she read aloud. Upon your arrival in Willow Ridge, I will reimburse the remainder of your rail fare and make arrangements for marriage within the week, provided the Lord grants safe passage. Deputy Pike looked up. Preston's mouth hardened. Nora held out the paper, but not to Preston. She gave it to the deputy. There is his promise. Preston's voice sharpened. A sentimental copy proves nothing. Then this may help. Nora lifted Mrs. Crow's invoice from the boarding house, then Rose Callahan's ledger page, then a list of names copied in her own hand. Rose Callahan, Mabel Price, June Atwood, Sarah Bell, Eleanor Whitcomb. Different women. Same fees. Same language. Same boarding house. Same promise of respectability after abandonment. Mrs. Crow stepped forward. Those are private accounts. Wade finally spoke, his voice low from behind Nora's shoulder. Private to the women you trapped or private to the men who profited? Preston pointed toward Wade. This is exactly what I warned you about, Deputy. Callahan has filled her head with accusations because he has his own grievance. Nora turned to Wade before the deputy could look that way. No, the word was quiet, but it cut clean through the rain. Mr. Callahan did not fill my head. He gave me a dry place to think. That was all. She faced Preston again. You thought because I was cold, embarrassed, and alone, I would be too grateful for any roof to ask who built the debt above it. The deputy's expression changed. Papers in his hand no longer seemed as certain as when he arrived. Preston saw it and forced a smile. Miss Whitcomb is emotional. She was rejected, and rejection wounds pride. Nora felt the insult land, but not where it used to. Yes, she said. It does. The honesty silenced him for a breath. But wounded pride does not forge 5 women's names into the same pattern of debt. Mrs. Crow's hand tightened around the umbrella handle. You have no authority to keep my records. Nora lifted the trunk key. They were found in Mr. Callahan's old accounts and in papers. Bearing my name. I am keeping what bears my name until a judge reads it. Deputy Pike folded Preston's claim and placed it back inside his folder, but this time he did not close the flap. This needs to be heard in town. Preston's face lost its polish. Deputy, you cannot be serious. I am serious enough to ask both of you to appear at the depot meeting room tomorrow morning. He looked at Nora. Bring every paper you have, Miss Whitcomb. Nora nodded. Preston's eyes flicked to the trunk, and for the first time she saw not contempt, but fear of what else might be inside. Wade stepped down one porch step, not threatening, simply present. You heard the deputy. Preston backed toward the buggy, Rains spotting his fine coat. You will regret dragging your name through town again. Nora closed the trunk with a firm click. No, she said. Tomorrow the town hears every promise you sold me. The buggy rolled away through the mud, carrying Preston and Mrs. Crow back toward Willow Ridge. Nora stood on the porch until they disappeared beyond the cottonwoods. Only then did her knees weaken. Wade moved closer, but stopped before touching her. Nora. She drew a breath, lifted the trunk key, and closed her fingers around it. I am all right. And this time, to her own surprise, she almost believed it. By the next morning, Willow Ridge Depot no longer looked like the place where Nora Whitcomb had been left behind. It looked like a place waiting to be judged. The rain had passed in the night, leaving the platform clean and gray beneath a pale sky, and the rails shone in two bright lines stretching east and west as if the whole country were listening. Townspeople gathered near the freight room where benches had been dragged into rows. The station master stood by the stove with his cap in both hands. Deputy Pike kept a table near the front, his leather folder beside an inkstand. Preston Vale arrived in his black coat, polished and pale, with Mrs. Crow at his side carrying her own ledger pressed to her chest. Nora stood outside the depot door for one long breath, her trunk at her feet and her hands folded around the key. The last time she had stood on this platform, she had been wet, cold, and ashamed of needing anyone to witness her pain. Now the same boards waited beneath her boots, and her body remembered every inch of them. Wade stood a few steps behind her, close enough that his shadow touched the edge of her skirt, not close enough to cover her. You do not have to do this alone, he said quietly. Nora looked at the depot windows, at the faces inside, at the place where Preston had turned away as if her life were a parcel misdelivered. I know, she said. That is why I can. She lifted the trunk handle before Wade could reach for it. It was heavy and her arms ached before she reached the door, but carrying it mattered. The town needed to see that the thing they called baggage had become evidence. Inside, whispers followed her down the aisle. Some eyes softened. Some looked away. Some stared with the hunger people have for another person's humiliation when they can pretend it is concern. Nora set the trunk beside the front table and faced the room. Deputy Pike cleared his throat. This meeting concerns a debt claim filed by Mr. Preston Vale and Mrs. Lydia Crow against Miss Eleanor Whitcomb. Preston stood immediately. A simple matter, Deputy. Miss Whitcomb traveled under an assumption, then refused reasonable arrangements after I declined to proceed. Mrs. Crow acted generously in offering respectable work to settle lodging and related costs. Nora heard the word respectable and thought of a clean cloth laid over spoiled bread. Deputy Pike turned to her. Miss Whitcomb, you may answer. Nora opened the trunk. She did not rush. First, she laid out Preston's letters in order, each one unfolded and weighted with a small spool of thread from her sewing tin. Then Mrs. Crow's invoice. Then Rose Callahan's ledger page. Then the copied list of women's names. Her hands trembled once, only once, and Wade did not move. That helped more than if he had. Mr. Vale says I traveled under an assumption, Nora began. Her voice sounded strange in the freight room, softer than Preston's, but clearer. These are his letters. In this one, he asks whether I can cook for a household. In this one, he says Willow Ridge has a church fit for a spring wedding. In this one, he promises to reimburse my remaining rail fare after arrival. She lifted the copy and handed it to Deputy Pike. I copied that letter before leaving Pennsylvania because my aunt taught me never to trust distance with the only proof a woman has. A murmur moved through the benches. Preston smiled thinly. A copy in her own hand. Then read the seal impression, Nora said. I pressed it from the original while the wax was still soft. The station master leaned forward as Deputy Pike examined the paper. That is Vale's mark, he said. I have seen it on mail orders. Preston's smile thinned further. Nora picked up the invoice from Mrs. Crow. This was written after one night in her boarding house. Room, firewood, linen, trunk storage, inconvenience, reputation consideration. A woman near the back gave a disgusted little sound. Mrs. Crow rose. A respectable house must protect itself from scandal. Nora looked at her. No. You charged women for the scandal others made of them. She turned to the room and read the names from her list. Rose Callahan, Mabel Price, June Atwood, Sarah Bell, Eleanor Whitcomb. Different arrivals. Different letters. Same boarding house. Same fees. Same promise that work would make the debt disappear. A gray-haired woman in the second row stood so abruptly the bench creaked. June Atwood was my sister. Her voice shook. She wrote that she owed money after a man failed to meet her. We thought she had been careless. Mrs. Crow's face tightened. The station master removed his cap completely. I remember Miss Atwood. Mrs. Crow collected her trunk from storage. Another man near the freight door spoke up. Mabel Price passed through here too. Worked 3 months at the boarding house kitchen before she left town. One voice loosened another. The pattern Nora had seen in ink began to rise in living testimony around the room. Preston stepped forward, color high in his face. This is sentiment, not law. Miss Whitcomb is embarrassed because she was refused, and now she seeks revenge through Mr. Callahan's old grief. Nora felt the words aim for Wade, felt the room glance toward him, felt the story trying to turn away from her again. She placed both hands on the table and leaned forward. No, the room quieted. Wade Callahan did not give me these letters. He did not write Mrs. Crow's fees. He did not put Rose's name in a debt book. He did not leave me on this platform and call it a misunderstanding. I am the one standing here. Answer me. Preston's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, he had no polished line ready. Mrs. Crow reached suddenly for the invoice, but Wade's voice came from below the platform, low and firm. Her words stand. He did not touch Mrs. Crow. He did not need to. Deputy Pike took the invoice before she could. This claim is suspended, he said. All related accounts will be held until Judge Whitcomb arrives from Cheyenne. Preston stared at him. You are making a grave mistake. The deputy looked at the table covered in paper, then at the women in the room who were no longer looking away. No, he said. I believe we are correcting one. Outside, a train whistle sounded in the distance, long and mournful over the prairie. Nora turned toward the open depot door. The sound that had ended her old hope now seemed to announce something else. Not victory yet. Not safety fully. But the first clean breath after a lie had been named aloud. Judge Whitcomb did not arrive that afternoon, but the truth had already changed the air inside Willow Ridge Depot. People no longer looked at Nora as if she were a problem brought in by the train. They looked at the letters on the table, the invoices, the copied names, and then at Preston Vale and Lydia Crow with the slow discomfort of people realizing they had been polite to cruelty because cruelty had worn good clothes. Preston sensed it too. His face had lost its polished ease, and every time someone whispered behind him, his shoulders stiffened beneath his black coat. Mrs. Crow kept both hands folded over her ledger, but her knuckles had gone white. Deputy Pike began gathering the papers into an evidence folder, and Nora felt a strange emptiness open in her chest. She had done what she came to do. She had spoken. She had shown proof. Still, the room was waiting for something larger than documents. Preston gave it to them. This is absurd, he said, his voice rising enough to expose the panic beneath it. You are all prepared to believe a woman who arrived with no money, no family, and no proper place to go, simply because Callahan has decided she is useful to his old sorrow. The words moved across the room and found Nora, but they no longer entered her the way they once might have. She stood beside the table with her palms resting on the worn wood and looked at him as if he were a man on the far side of a river. You keep trying to make my value depend on whether a man wants me, she said. First you said I was not enough to be your wife. Now you say I only matter because Wade Callahan showed me kindness. You are wrong both times. Preston laughed once, sharp and brittle. Then what are you, Miss Wickham? A bride without a groom? A lady without a household? A woman who mistakes pity for rescue? The room went still. Wade, standing below the platform, moved one boot forward, then stopped himself. Nora saw it, and the restraint filled her with more strength than any defense would have. He was letting her have the ground. She turned fully toward Preston. I am Eleanor Whitcomb, she said. I crossed 1,800 miles because I believed a promise. I was ashamed when that promise failed, but the shame was never mine to keep. I can cook. I can sew. I can keep accounts. I can read a lie when it is dressed up as a fee. I do not need to be chosen by you to become worthy, and I do not need to be married today to be whole. A woman near the back lowered her handkerchief from her mouth. The station master stared at the floor. Deputy Pike stopped writing. Nora lifted the trunk key from her pocket and placed it on the table. This trunk carried everything I had left. Yesterday, I thought that meant I had very little. Now I know it carried proof, memory, and enough of me to begin again. Preston's mouth tightened. Pretty speeches do not erase debt. Wade stepped onto the platform then, not in front of Nora, but beside her. He bent, lifted the trunk with both hands, and for a breath the whole room seemed to remember the rainy afternoon when he had carried it away from Preston's insult. But this time Wade did not take it to his wagon. He set it down beside Nora's skirts, close enough for her hand to rest on the lid. Then he faced the town. This belongs to her, he said. So does her future. The words were plain, without ornament, and, because of that, they carried farther than a speech. Preston's eyes narrowed. Careful, Callahan. A man can ruin his name over a woman who is not his. Wade looked at Nora first, as if asking permission to answer where her life was concerned. She gave the smallest nod. Only then did he turn back. If she ever comes home with me, he said, it will be because she chooses the road. Not because I carried her trunk. Not because you rejected her. Not because this town needs a cleaner story. Because she says yes with a free heart. Nora's throat tightened, but she did not look away. This was not the hard public claim she had feared from men who wanted possession. This was a public release of every chain Preston had tried to name. The town heard it. So did Preston. Mrs. Crow snapped her ledger shut. Deputy, surely you will not allow this theater to continue. Deputy Pike took the ledger from her before she could tuck it under her arm. Until Judge Whitcomb arrives, all account books related to these claims remain with this office. Mrs. Crow's face paled. That book is private property. So were the letters you held, Nora said quietly. The older woman looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time Nora saw not power but fear dressed in black lace. Preston turned toward the door, but the station master stepped into his path, not touching him, only standing there with his cap in hand and his back straight. Mr. Vale, Deputy Pike said, you and Mrs. Crow will remain available in town. Do not attempt to remove records, close accounts, or leave Willow Ridge before the judge reviews the evidence. Preston looked around the room for support. He found none steady enough to hold him. The same people who had watched Nora shiver now watched him with open doubt. That was its own consequence, immediate and unmistakable. His authority had begun to drain away in public, drop by drop. When the meeting ended, people did not rush to Nora all at once. They approached carefully, as if ashamed kindness might bruise if offered too suddenly. The gray-haired woman whose sister had been named touched Nora's sleeve and whispered, June was not foolish, was she? Nora shook her head. No. She was promised something. The woman closed her eyes. That seemed to be answer enough. Outside, the clouds had broken, and sunlight lay across the platform in long pale boards. Nora stepped into it carrying her own letters. Wade walked beside her, hands empty. Near the wagon, he reached into his coat and drew out an envelope. I was going to give this to you at the ranch, he said. But after today, I figure choices should not wait on my timing. Nora opened it. Inside was a train ticket, paid in full, good in either direction from Willow Ridge, and a folded note showing 2 weeks of wages for the work she had done at Callahan Ranch. She stared at the paper. You are paying me? You worked. And the ticket? Yours. Even if I use it? Wade's expression did not change, but something tender moved behind his eyes. Especially then. Nora looked from the ticket to the rails, then toward the road leading out to the ranch. A day ago, the sight of a train ticket would have felt like escape. Now it felt like proof that staying could mean something different if leaving was truly possible. She folded the envelope carefully and placed it in her reticule beside her letters. I will keep it, she said. Wade nodded. Good. But I am not using it today. For the first time since she had met him, Wade Callahan almost smiled. Not fully. Just enough to warm the weathered lines of his face. Nora touched the top of her trunk, no longer ashamed of its weight. Behind them, the depot bell rang as another train approached, but she did not flinch at the sound. She stood on the platform where she had been abandoned, with her name restored to her own keeping, and understood that home was no longer a promise someone could sell her. It was a choice she was learning to make. Judge Whitcomb arrived in Willow Ridge. 2 mornings later on the early train from Cheyenne, carrying a leather case, a gray wool coat, and the look of a man who had spent too many years watching paper become a weapon in careful hands. The hearing was held inside the depot meeting room because that was where the claims had begun to unravel, and by 9 o'clock nearly the whole town had gathered again. Nora stood near the front table with her trunk at her feet, her letters stacked neatly beside Rose Callahan's ledger page, Mrs. Crow's invoice, and the list of women whose names had been turned into debts. Wade stood along the wall with Amos Reed, his hat in his hands, close enough for Nora to know he was there, far enough for no one to mistake his presence for ownership. Preston Vale sat stiffly beside Mrs. Crow, his face pale, his gloves folded too carefully in his lap. Judge Whitcomb read every letter, every fee, every copied promise, and every account that carried the same pattern. He asked the station master about mail handling. He asked the gray-haired woman about June Atwood. He asked Deputy Pike where the records had been kept. Last, he looked at Nora. Miss Whitcomb, did Mr. Vale promise reimbursement of your remaining fare and marriage upon arrival? Nora lifted her chin. Yes, Your Honor. He did. Did you agree to lodging debt, brokerage debt, reputation fees, or labor service under Mrs. Crow? No, Your Honor. I agreed to become a wife, not a debtor. The judge nodded once and turned the copied letter toward Preston. Then the claim is void. The breach belongs to the man who made the promise and denied it, not to the woman who traveled in reliance upon it. A low murmur moved through the room. Judge Whitcomb raised one hand and silence returned. All debts filed against Miss Eleanor Whitcomb by Preston Vale and Lydia Crow are dismissed. The boarding house accounts connected to the named women will be seized for county review. Mr. Vale, your mercantile license and mail contract privileges are suspended pending formal charges of fraud. Mrs. Crow, your boarding house ledger is now evidence. You will repay unlawful fees already collected, beginning with the women named here or there. Families if they cannot be found. Mrs. Crow's mouth opened, but no sound came. Preston stood too quickly. Your Honor, this is an outrage. You would destroy a respectable business over the complaint of a rejected bride. Judge Whitcomb looked over his spectacles. No, Mr. Vale. I would destroy a dishonest one over proof. Deputy Pike stepped forward then, not roughly, but with authority, and escorted Preston and Mrs. Crow from the room to the sheriff's office. No one followed them with sympathy. Men who had once nodded to Preston on the boardwalk looked away. Women who had once lowered their voices near Mrs. Crow now watched her pass with lifted chins. By noon, the notice board outside the depot carried the judge's ruling, and by sundown the sign on Mrs. Crow's boarding house had been taken down. The depot platform felt different afterward, though the boards were the same and the wind still smelled of coal smoke and rain. Nora stood beside her trunk, the train ticket Wade had given her tucked safely inside her reticule. The ticket was still good east or west. She could leave that afternoon, or the next, or any day she chose. That was what made staying possible. Wade came to stand several feet away, leaving open space between them and the rails. I will drive you wherever you ask, he said. Depot, church, another town, back to the ranch. You do not owe me an answer today. Nora looked down the track toward the east, where Pennsylvania lay somewhere beyond miles of prairie, rivers, mountains, and memory. Then she looked west, toward the road that led to Callahan Ranch, with its smoky stove, disordered pantry, quiet hallway, and a closed room that no longer felt like a warning, but like a wound waiting for light. "I came here because a man promised me a home," she said. "I thought that meant I had to be chosen before I could belong anywhere." Wade said nothing. His stillness gave her room. Nora touched the key to her trunk. "I am not staying because I have no fare. I have one. I am not staying because I need a man to repair my name. The judge did that, and I did my part." She turned toward him fully. "I am staying because I choose the road back to Callahan Ranch. I choose the work waiting there. I choose the woman I become when no one is bargaining over me." Wade's eyes softened, but he did not reach for her. "Then I would be honored to drive you home." The word home settled gently this time, not like bait, not like a promise sold by ink, but like a door she had seen and decided to open. 1 week later, after Sunday service, Wade asked Nora to stand with him beneath the cottonwoods beside the small white church. The town was there, not because he had demanded witnesses, but because some wrongs needed to be answered in the same public air that had carried them. Wade held his hat against his chest. Nora stood beside him in her blue calico dress, her auburn hair pinned simply beneath a clean bonnet, her soft, chubby face calm in the morning light. Her trunk rested near the wagon, not hidden, not heavy with shame, just part of her journey. Wade looked at the gathered townspeople, then at Nora. "I did not pick up her trunk to claim her," he said, his voice steady. "I picked it up because no woman should carry shame alone. I do not own her road, her name, or her future. I choose Eleanor Whitcomb with respect, and if she will have me, I will walk beside her for as long as she chooses me back." Nora felt the words move through the crowd and return to her changed. Not ownership. Not rescue as debt. A choice offered open-handed. She stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "I was left at this depot as if I were a parcel refused at delivery," she said. "But I was never unwanted by God, never worthless because one man lacked honor, and never bound to shame because others profited from it. Wade Callahan gave me shelter, but he did not give me my worth. I brought that with me. Today I choose him because I am free to do so." They were married that winter, not in haste and not from gratitude, but after months of shared work, quiet suppers, repaired fences, balanced accounts, and trust built one ordinary day at a time. Nora became more than the mistress of Callahan Ranch. She became its bookkeeper, its steady heart, and the woman ranch hands asked before ordering supplies because she knew exactly what was needed and what was nonsense. In spring, she and Wade opened Rose's room. They washed the curtains, aired the quilt, placed a writing desk by the window, and set a small oil lamp on the table for any woman who came through Willow Ridge needing to write home, read a letter, or decide what came next. Judge Whitcomb's review found 4 more women harmed by the scheme, and restitution was sent where it could be sent. Preston Vale lost his business and left the territory under formal charges. Lydia Crow's boarding house was sold to pay back the women she had trapped. The town women turned the building into a traveler's rest with clean beds, posted rates, and no hidden fees. 1 year later, the morning sun rose over Callahan Ranch in bands of gold, lighting the porch, the pasture, and the windmill turning slow above the well. Nora stood at the kitchen table, wedding ring plain and warm on her hand, writing receipts in a clean ledger with her name on the first page, Eleanor Whitcomb Callahan, ranch partner. Wade came in carrying firewood, paused to kiss her forehead with the tenderness of a man who still asked with his eyes before drawing near, and set the wood beside the stove. Outside, 2 young women from the Traveler's Rest laughed softly on the porch while waiting for breakfast and advice about letters they had received from men out west. Nora's old trunk sat polished beneath the window, no longer a symbol of rejection, but a reminder that she had carried proof, courage, and herself all the way to this life. The oil lamp burned low though morning had come. The ranch house smelled of biscuits and coffee, and beyond the open door the road to Willow Ridge shone bright under the rising sun. Nora had not been claimed like freight. She had not been saved into another cage. She had been heard, respected, chosen, and given room to choose back. And in the house she helped make warm, she became not the bride left shivering at the depot, but the woman who made sure no other woman had to stand there alone.